Hi everyone, and welcome to Chapter 3. We're going to be discussing heredity and environment in this chapter. So if we're going to start with heredity, we have to start with genes. And just as a reminder for those of you who remember from your biology class, or as new information from those of you who don't remember, 3 billion base pairs of amino acids make up our 70,000 to 100,000 genes that we all carry around with us. Those 70 to 100,000 genes are paired up into 46 chromosomes, are organized in 46 chromosomes, which are paired up into 23 pairs of chromosomes. All of that makes up one human cell and is repeated in all of your human cells. So when we say genes, we're referring to those building blocks of the chromosomes, right? And then the 46 chromosomes are lined up into the 23 pairs, half of which you got from your mom and half of which you got from your dad. And those pairs of chromosomes are going to interact with each other, interact with the environment. Some of them will be dominant, some of them will be recessive. There are a bunch of different factors that will determine how you actually express your genetic makeup. So let's just start with a really simple pair of chromosomes, which would be your sex chromosomes. That would be at the 23rd pair position. When we look at our entire set of 46 chromosomes, 44 of them are exactly the same regardless of whether you're male or female. There are no sex differences on those other chromosomes. The only actually one chromosome that differs is that the male has a Y where the female would have an X. So the male has an XY pattern and the female has an XX pattern. Now that seems super simple. It's either an XX or it's an XY. But as this picture depicts, it can be more complex with regard to what you inherit from which parent and what effect it has on you based on which of the X's from mom and whether it's an X or a Y from dad got paired up. So those two pairs, XY, XX, coming from mom and coming from dad, can be broken down into 4 different combinations. So those of you who have siblings of your same sex and have significant differences between the two of you on a lot of different measures, like for example, height or weight or things like that, you might be assuming that it's on your 44 other chromosomes that you differ. Or maybe you're attributing it to environmental things, like whether you have the same diet or whether one of you got sick when you were in the growth spurt or something. It might be that you're attributing it to that. But there's also the possibility that you differ on an X. Even if you're both brothers, you could have 2 different X's, one that came down from mom's mom or the one that came down from mom's dad. That's actually really relevant for men because the male pattern baldness is determined by the X that comes from mom's dad. So a man who wants to try and estimate whether he's likely to go bald as he ages would want to look at his mom's dad to determine that. And that's kind of an interesting example of how things that we oftentimes would look to our same-sex parent to make predictions about might be attributable to our other sex parent. So I thought I'd use that nice simple one to show us the pairing. Now this chart shows us things that are associated with the X chromosome. Here we have color blindness as our example of a sex-linked outcome. So at the 23rd pair, you can have 2 X's that are non-coded for color blindness, and that's going to be a woman who, in her phenotype, in her expression of her genes, she is normal color vision. And because she doesn't have the color blindness gene on either of her X chromosomes, she's not a carrier of it either. So that means that she did not inherit color blindness from her mother. She didn't inherit it from her dad. So her children, as a result, have no ability to inherit color blindness from her because she doesn't have it on either of her X's. And the next one, we have a man and the same exact thing. His X-linked gene does not have the color blindness code on it, and so as a result, he's going to be able to have normal color vision, and he's not going to be able to transmit color blindness to his offspring. All right, on the next level, we have a woman who has the color blindness code on one of her X chromosomes, but not on the other. As a result, she's going to have normal color vision, but she is what we call a carrier. She inherited this one in this case from her dad. So half of her children will inherit the X that has the color blindness gene on it. So that means that the girls who inherit her X gene that has that code on it, assuming that the dad doesn't always also contribute that to her offspring, would be carriers. If the only X that they get with that code on it came from mom, they will be carriers. But if she has a boy baby, she has a 50% chance that she'll donate that X with the color blindness gene on it, and her boys will be colorblind, or what we now call color deficiency. But this chart was easy for me to grab, so I got one with a bad label on it. Same thing here. Now the difference is she inherited it from her mom. Same exact outcome for her children. Her children don't care which of the parents made mom a carrier. All they care about is whether they inherited the X or not. Now, in this case, we have a colorblind man, and he can only inherit that X from mom. There's no way to inherit color blindness from dad, because color blindness is an X-linked gene. So when a boy is born colorblind, he inherited that trait from his mom. And it could have been through his mom's mom, or it could have been through his mom's dad. You never really know. If he has children, they're all going to have normal color vision, because he is not going to be able to create a colorblind child with just his one X. If he let's say that this colorblind man married one of the women from example 3 or 4 and produced children, and they both donated, he donates his X, and the woman donates one of the colorblind X's, then they would have a colorblind daughter, and he contributed to that. But he can't on his own make a colorblind child. Colorblind women, in that example that I just gave you, that's really rare, because you'd have to have a colorblind man making a daughter with a woman who is at least a carrier of colorblindness. I had a student once who had a colorblind son, and her husband was colorblind. And she was tripping out because she said, how can I I have normal vision. How did I make my son colorblind? And her pediatrician had told her that the colorblindness was inherited down the mom's line. And she could not understand, how could I be the one when I can see normally and my husband's the one who's colorblind? Well, unbeknownst to her, she was a carrier, and she had donated that X chromosome. As I talked to her longer, came to find out that her dad was colorblind. So she inherited that colorblind X chromosome from her dad. She was just a carrier, so she had no expression of that trait in herself. But then when she made a son, he carried her X that she got from her dad. It turns out she didn't have any daughters, but had she had any daughters, they would have been in that category of the very rare women who might have inherited the mom's colorblind gene that she inherited from her dad, and then the dad's one X that he has, and he's colorblind. And so the two of them could have made colorblind daughters. They happened not to have any daughters, so it was a moot point. But it's pretty rare. Usually, daughters are carriers, and sons are expressors of the trait. All right. Now, another issue with genes that's really interesting to us psychologists is these little natural experiments we like to call twins. If you're a twin of any sort, you know that people are fascinated by twins. And, we like to have all these stories about how they can communicate without having to speak and all these different things. Well, psychologists don't really look at those kinds of things. I mean, they have basically eliminated that old wives' tale, but twins still seem to think they have that kind of communication. So who am I to say it doesn't happen? But what I wanted to focus on, and what psychologists are really interested in, is how twins give us some insight into those qualities that you might have inherited through your genes versus those qualities that you might have acquired through your experience. So twins are a great little experiment. There are different kinds of twins. There are lots of different kinds of twins, but I'm just going to break them down into two groups. Monozygotic would be twins that are created from a single egg that gets fertilized by a single sperm. That's what's going on in the row A. We've got a single, well, actually all of these are examples. We've got a single fertilized egg on the left-hand side of all three rows. It starts to divide and split like all fertilized eggs do. And then for some reason, at some point during development, the single egg divides into two different masses of cells. So in the top row, you see it dividing into two cells very early. So you're ending up with those two cells still developing out of one placenta and out of, but yet in their own amniotic sacs. In the middle row, you see them dividing a little later, and so you have them in the same amniotic sac on the right-hand side. So 100% of their genes in common, sharing the same amniotic sac and the same placenta. The twins in row B are going to have a much more similar experience in the womb than the twins in row A, who are in separate amniotic sacs but have the same placenta. And the ones in row A are going to be more similar to each other than the ones in row C, where they divided so early that they actually formed their own placentas and their own amniotic sacs. So all three of these sets of twins in this picture are all identical. They are monozygotic. They started off as a single egg. Mono means one and zygote means egg. So a single fertilized egg divided into two individuals. And to be honest, it can be triplets, it can be quadruplets. It's scientifically possible to have any number of identicals. It's much more common to be twins than triplets, but triplets happen. It's much more common to be twins than quadruplets, although there's at least one living set of quadruplets that are identical right now. It can happen. Now, a lot of times you'll hear monozygotic twins referred to as MZ twins because it's, shorthand. It's kind of harder to say MZ than monozygotic, but it's easier to write MZ. They're also referred to as identical because they have 100% of their genes in common, and so they are genetically identical. Now, I told you when I started this whole talk, that this whole discussion of twins, that I was going to give you two basic groups of twins. The truth is, we are now understanding more about genes than we used to know, and monozygotic twins are not necessarily 100% genetically the same, but we're just going to sort of gloss over that for right now and talk about them as if they are identical, 100% of their genes in common. Dizygotic twins, well, we still have zygote in there, right? So we have di, two, zygote, two zygotes. So we oftentimes refer to these as DZ twins or fraternal twins. And the only way you can have dizygotic twins would be if mom releases more than one egg in a menstrual cycle, and they both get fertilized by separate sperm and go on to develop their own placentas, their own amniotic sacs, and grow to develop. Now you'll notice in example D, the placentas have fused. And so what can be really confusing at birth is when a pair of twins is born, you can't necessarily tell whether they're monozygotic or dizygotic just by the condition of their placenta. If they're in the same amniotic sac, that can only happen if they're identical twins. But they used to think, well, if they have different placenta, then they're, by definition, dizygotic. And if they have the same placenta, they have to be monozygotic. And now we realize, no, the placentas can fuse in dizygotic twins. The placentas can be separate in identical twins. So we really have to rely on genes to determine whether twins are monozygotic or dizygotic. Actually, there's one really easy way to tell whether they're mono or di. If one's a boy and one's a girl, they have to be dizygotic. Monozygotic, you have to be the same sex because you have the same genes in common. That is not an environmental factor to determine whether you're male or female. So if you're both the same sex, you could be monozygotic, you could be dizygotic. But if you're a mixed sex pair, one of you is male and one of you is female, then you are by definition dizygotic. So that kind of helps. If you ever see a boy-girl pair of twins out on the street, don't ask if they're identical, because by definition they're not. Now, dizygotic twins are a lot more variable than monozygotic. Here we have a mother and a father, both are mixed race, and these little girls are their dizygotic twins that were conceived, at the same time, carried at the same time, and obviously one of them inherited more of the recessive traits that their parents were carrying, and the other one's is revealing more of the dominant traits that their parents are carrying. Dizygotic twins only share 50% of their genes. They're just like regular siblings. And so just like those of you who have regular siblings might differ on hair color or texture, eye color, height, weight, all these things that might be attributable to genes, so can dizygotic twins. So what's really neat about twins, that what makes them a natural experiment, is that monozygotic twins give us the ability to hold genes steady in the experiment, right? They share the same genes. And then we can look at the effect of environment outside of those genes. Dizygotic twins, they only share 50% of their genes in common, but they were in the same environment from conception on. So we can compare them to regular siblings who have the same amount of genes in common, but their environments are not as similar. I mean, from conception, dizygotic twins have been in the same environment, whereas regular siblings are at least 9 months different in age. They've, typically don't get referred to as the twins and, get sent to all the same birthday parties and things like that, like twins might get. And so with dizygotic twins, we can test the effect of genes and then compare them to regular siblings and look at the impact of environment. So we get a lot of information from these naturally occurring experiments called twins. I just thought I'd throw in here, since this is a lifespan development class, that one of the things that we've been noticing over the past several decades, and my data stops in 2008, but really 2006, what we're seeing is among people who are less than 25 years old, the rate of twins has not changed. It's stayed nice and steady. As people are aging, 25 to 39, we're starting to see higher rates of twins, and especially in women over the age of 40. Actually, what we're seeing is a huge spike in the number of women over 40 having children. And a lot of times to have children over the age of 40, you need some kind of hormonal assistance for conception, and that can oftentimes produce multiple ovulations in one menstrual cycle, and they both get fertilized, and you end up with twins or more. So these are triplets and higher order births. So you can see it's very rare to happen naturally, as evidenced by the women who are less than 25, and much more common among people who are using, hormonal fertility treatments. All right, so we've outlined genes and what we mean by that word. We've explained, if you hear barking in the background, by the way, I'm sorry, my 2 dogs are wrestling, so I'm trying to ignore it. So we've explored what genes are. We've talked about how we have these naturally occurring experiments in the form of twins. These twin studies have started to give us a lot of insight into epigenetics. The idea that your genes are not just the static blueprint for how you're supposed to be designed, but instead your genes react to each other and your genes react to the environment. So genes interact with the environment. So I used some of these words earlier, but let's define them clearly here. Genotype. Genotype refers to the genetic code that's carried in all your cells. So that set of DNA, those pairs of chromosomes, that's your genotype. Then we have your phenotype. That's your expression of those genes. So how your combination of genes express themselves. So you might have a genotype for blue eyes, and then you have a phenotype of blue eyes. That's what we're talking about here. I've got an example here where we've got hair color, and we've got a mom who has black hair and a dad who has red hair. Now, for those of you who are redheads, you know that that's a recessive trait. And so dad, to have red hair, that means he has 2 recessive red hair genes. Mom, having black hair, you don't know what her other gene might carry. You guys have insight into it because I showed you she has a red gene as her recessive trait. So she's expressing in her phenotype black hair, but she's carrying in her genotype red hair. And then this Punnett square shows you what the probabilities are that each of their children would have what kind of phenotype. I'll just tell you that this set of lectures this quarter might be heavily laden with the fact that I'm looking forward to the birth of my first grandchild. My daughter's having a baby soon. And my mom and I were talking about the fact that I have brown eyes, my husband has blue eyes, and so my daughter has brown eyes. And so that means that my daughter's phenotype is brown eyes, blue eyes. She has brown dominant, and then she's carrying a blue-eyed recessive trait. Her husband has blue eyes. And so I was saying to my mom, my daughter has a 50% chance of producing blue-eyed children. And my mom said, oh no, the brown always wins. That's not how genes work. Brown does not always win. Brown has to be present for brown to win. So the fact that half of my daughter's eggs carry the blue-eyed gene that she got from my husband and half of her eggs carry the brown-eyed gene that she got from me means that there's a 50-50 chance. And then, of course, her husband, my daughter's husband, only has blue genes. So there's a 50% chance that she donated a brown eye carrying egg. There's a 50% chance that she donated a blue eye carrying egg. So we'll be finding out soon what the mystery of the eye color of the baby is. Now, of course, there is the fact that our genes do interact with each other in a lot of different ways. What I just discussed was really a dominant recessive pattern, but not all genes work like that. Some genes work in what we call additive heredity. Skin color is a great example. So we have the sperm on the top part, and we have the eggs along the bottom part, and how they can combine for skin color pigment so that they actually add together. So if both of the parents have the very light genes, then they merge together to give very light outcomes. And if they both have very dark genes, they combine to give very dark outcomes. But then you've got that full gradation in between where you could have any shade that is, a mixture of whatever the parents are contributing to each other. I mean, if we were to go back to our picture of this family, you'll notice that mom is of a lighter tone than dad. The sister on the left inherited the darker version of both parents' genes, right? So that she ended up with a darker pattern, and the daughter on the right received the lightest pattern that both parents could contribute. It's an additive trait, so on average, the children will be a mixture of the two parents' genes and produce skin tones that are somewhere in between them, on average. Height is the same way. On average, children will be somewhere in height. Their final height will be somewhere between their two parents' heights. It's not a guarantee, though. In my particular family, I have two children, and so I assumed my children would be somewhere between, I'm 5'9" and my husband's 6'2", so I figured somewhere between there would be my two children. And my daughter is 5'7", so she's 2 inches shorter than me, and my son is 6'4", so he's 2 inches taller than my husband. So they're both outside the additive range, so it's not always a given that it's going to mix together and give you in between. We're talking about averages. So on average, you'll end up with an additive property of the two parents' genes on certain kinds of traits, height being one of them, skin color being another one. It's usually not something like eyes, but the research is starting to point out that eyes are probably not purely just dominant recessive like we used to think. That you can end up with sort of a mixing of the genes for what color light reflects off your eyes. I thought I'd share with you this picture also. I don't know if you guys recognize the lady in the middle was Catwoman in the old-timey Batman from a million years ago. And she's of mixed race. And then her husband was a white man, and so that's her daughter on the right. And then that's her granddaughter on the left. Sometimes when the recessive traits have been inherited, no, let me put it this way. If the recessive traits have been inherited, only the recessive traits can be passed on by those offspring. So while Eartha Kitt carries dominant traits that she's expressing in herself, she gave the recessive traits to her daughter on the right, who then only had those to pass on to her own daughter who's on the left. So clearly, either Eartha Kitt's daughter bleaches her hair or her husband had darker hair, and that's how the granddaughter has darker hair. The darker hair did not come through the blonde-haired mom to the dark-haired daughter. That's not how dominant genes work. If they're present, they'll be expressed. So going back to the eye example that I was giving about my potential, my future grandchild, if the dominant gene is present, it'll be expressed. And if the recessive trait is present, it may be suppressed by the dominant trait. You have to have two matching recessive traits for that quality to be expressed in the offspring. So blue eyes would be an example of something that requires two genes for that trait to be expressed in the phenotype. Blonde hair or red hair. Red hair is the most recessive of the traits. And so if you have a blonde hair gene and a redhead gene, blonde will be expressed. So I'm trying to think of other good examples of just like purely dominant recessive. It's kind of tough. There are a few things. We used to think curly hair was purely dominant or recessive, with curls being dominant. But now we realize the interaction of genes. Genes interact with each other. And so the presence of curly genes, but they combine with hair texture, hair density, how many hairs per square inch of your scalp, those kinds of things. Here are some examples of some genetic diseases and conditions that are, if you look at you got the title on the far left, so you've got, albinism or albinism, which is where you don't have any melanin. So if you go across, it has a column there labeled probable inheritance, and you'll see we are pretty confident about certain things. Like you have to inherit two recessive genes for albinism for a person to be albino. So it's very rare because you need those two genes to match. Other things, you'll notice a lot of them say multifactorial, like the early onset type of Alzheimer's disease is dominant, but after age 60, that type of Alzheimer's disease is multifactorial. So we have homed in on, okay, if you get it when you're 50 or younger, that's probably a dominant gene that you inherited from your ancestors. But if you get it when you're older, we don't know the genetic component yet. You go down, cancer, multifactorial. Cleft palate, cleft lip, multifactorial. Clubfoot, multifactorial. Cystic fibrosis is a recessive gene, but there are spontaneous mutations that can cause that disease that causes mucus obstructions in the lungs and things. Deafness, there are lots of different kinds of deafness. Some forms are completely recessive. Some, it takes a combination of things to produce that outcome. So going down this list, you can kind of see that we don't have a ton of things that we really can say if you have the gene, it's expressed or not. Notice on this list we have hemophilia. That's one that's X-linked. And so if mom is carrying the X-linked X, she could be a carrier, have none of the symptoms of hemophilia, but then if she makes a son with that X, then he could have that disorder. So unfortunately, there's a pretty long list of this, right? There are a lot. This is not even remotely comprehensive, this list of things that we know have genetic components to them. So you can take your time and look over that list of different kinds of disorders that have genetic components, but I think this sets you up nicely for us to move on to chapter 4. So I will stop here.